The International Monetary Fund has cut its global growth forecast for the year, saying the world economy is in a delicate state. It's the third downgrade since October and comes on the eve of meetings between the IMF and the World Bank in Washington. The fund is forecasting global growth to come in at 3.3% this year, the weakest since 2016, while the IMF has slightly boosted its outlook for China after the US suspended further tariff hikes. It expects major economies such as the US, Europe and Japan to slow down. But it says some emerging economies could enjoy a boost in the second half of the year, while warning of significant risks that could lead to further downgrades.
So while the global economy continues to grow at a reasonable rate, and a global recession is not in the baseline projections, there are many downside risks. Tensions in trade policy could flare up again and play out in other areas, such as the auto sector, with large disruptions to global supply chains. Growth in systemic countries, areas like the euro area and China could surprise on the downside. And the risks surrounding Brexit remain heightened.
Well, let's get back to Craig Copetas in Paris. Craig, we know Donald Trump has had a disdain for multilateral organisations such as the IMF, but in this case, do you think the US president should be listening to the IMF's warnings? The IMF said that the various trade wars that he started with countries around the world has prompted them to downgrade global growth. Do you think he should actually listen to their concerns?
President Donald Trump doesn't listen to anyone except himself. We've pretty much proven that over the past 2 years. Look, 75 years into the World Bank and the IMF, it's their 75th anniversary this year. What have we just heard? Well, we're seeing rising inequality, Oscar. We're seeing trade tensions and a planet in peril. That's what this is about. And you hear this same type of rhetoric out of the World Bank and the IMF with each passing year. Now, at the core of this problem is the World Bank likes privatizing public services. But when you privatize gains, you socialize losses. Massive structural changes need to be made in the world. Massive structural changes. Climate change, everything else, we all know that. What's very difficult, Oscar, is to put this economic stew on a plate for people to actually look at. I tried to isolate today for tonight. I want to go to the United States for a minute. Most powerful, richest country in the world. 18% of Americans have enough money saved to cover 3 months of their living expenses. 46% of Americans don't have $500 to cover an emergency need. And households with the lowest net worth hold an average of $10,308 in credit card debt. Those are sobering and shocking statistics. Now, if you extrapolate that out globally to Asia, to Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, where poverty is rampant, that will give you a real indication of what dire straits we're in right now.
Okay, and just quickly, Craig, what about the future for organisations like the IMF and the World Bank? So this warning comes just ahead of their spring meetings. The two organisations have traditionally worked hand in hand, but right. Donald Trump has now appointed one of his supporters who's slammed the World Bank to actually lead the World Bank. So how might that change the dynamic with the IMF, which, as you know, is traditionally led by someone from France?
Sure. Well, the World Bank and the IMF could do with a little summer slamming. There's no question about it. Look, in a nutshell, here's what it is. We keep talking about democratic socialism versus capitalism. It's time for the IMF and the World Bank to consider a new term and figure out how to make it happen. And that's called democratic capitalism. Because right now, capitalism, by the IMF's own admission, yes, okay, isn't very democratic. And it better get that way real quick, or there's going to be a lot of hurt locker going down.
Interesting. Craig Copetas in Paris, thanks for your time, as always.